Those always make us chuckle, don't they? Well, I have something to add about Henry David Thoreau, and it could be apocryphal, I'm not sure, but when I was teaching, I did read somewhere that when he lived in the woods, most evenings he ate with the Emersons. So, brought him food. So those of us who are thinking he was out there, gathering nuts and foraging, thank you, that wasn't the case. And the other story I heard was that when he was in jail, Emerson came to see him and said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau said to him, well, Waldo, what are you doing out there? We should be. Okay. So many times, and one of the advantages I think we have in this congregation is we hear from other voices. Even though I've always said, ministers have a couple of sermons and they keep redoing them in different ways. And it seems too that those of us who find things to share tend to find the same kind of things in different ways. So some of this is probably not going to be new information to you, but I hope that it inspires you to think about things maybe a little differently. It's called Souls on Fire, written by, Can You Use, Have Religious Experience? Standing, sheep and cows. Right. Richard Gilbert, who was at the First Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York, when he wrote this. It seems a Jesuit priest on a visit to Mexico observed young couples coming to the cathedral on a Sunday morning. As one approached the church, the senor handed the senorita through and into the nave, and then he stood on the stairs smoking a small cigar. Occasionally, he looked in to see how things were going at the altar. This happened again and again, until there was quite a crowd assembled. Intrigued, the priest went down into the plaza. Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Father. I see you escort the ladies to Mass and then wait outside. That's right, they said. You don't go into the cathedral yourselves? No, not generally. Well, that's puzzling. Aren't you Catholic? The men looked at him in consternation. Of course we're Catholics, but not fanatics. Unitarian Universalists have never been accused of being fanatics. The great jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes was asked at a dinner party what his religion was, and he answered Unitarian. Why? His interrogator continued. In Boston, everyone must be something, and the very least you can be is Unitarian. I know. Admittedly, we are, to say the least, differently religious. How different are we? For example, with all the interest in spirituality and mysticism in our time, do Unitarian Universalists have religious experiences? What is our emotional quotient, our EQ? Does it balance with our IQ? And what is our SQ, our spiritual quotient? Are we those who merely know the conventions, or those whose very souls burn? Or would that be too fanatic to admit? I am a fanatic. I emphatically believe Unitarian Universalism is religious. I know that we do have religious experiences that take us beneath our surface self and remind us that we are part of something greater than ourselves, that bring out the best in us, that transform our lives, that transcend the ordinary and give us a glimpse into another realm of being. Things that make life worth the living. Now, we who claim religion must be reasonable are perhaps a little wary. We are a bit like the sometimes cynical playwright Samuel Beckett, who was out for a ride with a friend on one of the most beautiful days of the year. "This is a marvelous day," Beckett exclaimed. "It sure is," replied his friend. "It's the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive." A frown crossed Beckett's face. "Well," he said, "I wouldn't go that far." I could hear that something like that from Beckett. Well, I would. I would say with cellist Pablo Casals, each second we live is a new and unique moment in the universe. A moment that never was before and never will be again. Such discernment of the ecstatic is the heart of traditional mysticism. Psychologist Abraham Maslow coined the term peak experiences to describe such moments for those more humanistically inclined. This peak experience is akin to the oceanic feeling of which Sigmund Freud spoke. Quote, "A peculiar feeling which never leaves one personally, a feeling which one would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, something oceanic. It's a purely subjective experience, not an article of belief. I cannot discover this oceanic feeling for myself," said Freud. He acknowledged the reality of the experience, but his own skeptical self could not partake of it. Was Freud a UU? Such ecstatic peak experiences mark our liberal religious tradition. The 19th century transcendentalists broke with the idea that religious experience came only from the Bible or could only be induced by the church. They believed in a direct experience of divinity. In one classic passage, Emerson writes, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and parcel of God." This kind of intuition has constituted the mystical experience through the ages, a sense that one is part of the greater whole, not simply a spectator of something grand, but an inherent part of it. The poet William Blake wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." This kind of experience, while we can never call it common, nevertheless has happened to real people that we know, maybe even ourselves. Perhaps we have not experienced the intensity of an Emerson or a Blake, nor can we describe it so eloquently, but we know whereof they speak. However, peak experience is not the only avenue to human spirituality. There are also valley experiences, moments of excruciating pain and suffering, despair and despondency that drive us deeper into our passionate and enduring center of faith. While none of us seek or anticipate such descents into the valleys of existence, they immeasurably enrich our lives. They tend to strip away all that is superficial and leave us with the fundamental essence of what it is to be human. What can we believe in the face of death? That life has been good for those who have lived it nobly and well. That we do not need the Christian promise of immortality to give meaning to our lives. That life, our life, goes on. That life, when all is said and done, is good. We know it because we experience its joy as deeply as we experience its pain. A minister friend once spoke about his son who died of AIDS. He wrote, "I was positive never again would I experience joy. I would have been content simply to find some release from the anguish. I wondered whether I could find that relief by a return to the religion of my youth. Perhaps I could find comfort once again in the arms of Jesus. So I attended a little fundamentalist church in Naples, Florida. It didn't work. I left the service as deeply in pain as when I entered it. That evening I took a sunset cruise out into the Gulf of Mexico. The sunset was unbelievable. The entire horizon was aglow with color. Reds and purples and pinks and golds, and then the colors faded, and that indescribably deep, deep indigo of late twilight filled the sky. The boat turned around to head back to Naples, and there on the eastern horizon was a full and glorious golden moon. I realized in that moment that even though my son's being had been scattered, he remained part of this awesome beauty. We can never contain the beauty in which we live and move and have our being. But whether we live or whether we die, we are contained in that beauty. Religious experience for the UU can be ecstatic, whether one be a humanist or a theist, or whether or not one believes in God. When we feel we are part of the larger whole, we have probed the religious dimensions of being. Religious experiences can be excruciatingly painful. We reach the depths within us, as much in pain as in joy. These experiences take us down to the agonies of the spirit. They are, nonetheless, religious. They grasp us totally, and they will not let us go. There is still a third kind of experience, too much neglected by those who study such matters. It's what I call a plateau experience, which is not marked by the ecstasy of the peak experience, nor the intensity of the valley experience. Rather, such an experience is characterized by a kind of serendipity, a sense of total well-being. The plateau is doubtless the experience that for many of us is the most sustaining and the most common. The glimpse of the sleeping child, so serene and peaceful now, who has been our nemesis not an hour before. I can expect that all parents can appreciate that. The restful pause after meaningful effort. The satisfaction that breaks through the routine now and then between two people deeply in love. The joy of pure solitude when there is nothing to distract. I cannot do better to illustrate the plateau experience than to cite my seminary dean and friend, Angus MacLean. Angus, a Scot through and through, he had a wonderfully self-deprecating sense of humor, and also he bespoke deep wisdom. Angus would relate his truths in anecdotal and appealing ways. His story. I had one of those unfortunate days when everything goes dead wrong. My wife was away and the house was a mess. The car wouldn't start and I had to walk to work. My morning's lecture at school was a flop, and one of the students wasn't afraid to say so. On my way home, I remembered the dog I had forgotten and left unfed and confined all day. I entered the house with a burden of guilt added to the frustrations and embarrassment, and there on the rug on the hall floor was the dog, eyes twinkling, and his great plume waving as though he were fully aware of my lapse and was making allowances. Then he sprang at me in greeting. The whole burden of the awful day was immediately lifted from me, and I felt whole again. To feel whole. Our mission as Unitarian Universalists is not to become holy and go to heaven. It is to become whole and make the earth a fit place for human habitation. I'm going to repeat that. Our mission as Unitarian Universalists is not to become holy and go to heaven. It is to become whole and make the earth a fit place for human habitation. What is a religious experience? How do you know if you've had one? What does it feel like? Religious experiences are not necessarily at the Himalayan mountaintop where one finds the latest guru of the New Age. One need not cast aside all worldly concern in a conscious preoccupation with the life of the spirit, thank heavens. One does not require the trappings of a traditional theology or even God. Religious experiences are part of the warp and weft of what it is to be human. The peaks, the valleys, the plateaus that we experience as we go about the business of earning a living, expressing love, serving the neighbor, celebrating the transience of life, which is our lot in life. And so, unless we are blind to beauty, deaf to the calls of righteous battle, incapable of prolonged reflection, a stranger to the poignancies of joy and sorrow, incapable of wonder, then we are in perpetual danger of falling into worship. There is only one catch, and that was stated strangely in a sign on a Las Vegas casino, and that says, "You must be present to win." There is more wisdom in this than first meets the eye. Too often we are absent to life. Too often we don't pay attention to the holy ground beneath our feet. Too often we do not listen to the music of the spheres. Too often we are too busy to serve the people who need what we alone can give. We must be present to win. And so I confess that the irreducible, passionate, and enduring center of my Unitarian Universalist faith is simply this. In the light of truth and the embrace of beauty, we unite for the celebration of life and the service of humanity. Our burning bushes, our blinding flashes of insight, our rites of passage are as common as the everyday if we are present to them. These are not the stuff of conventions. They are the tinder with which the soul comes ablaze. Blessed be.